I'm going to offer my reflections prior to the scripture reading this morning. Every now and then someone comes to me and says that they want to make God a part of their life. And I'm sorry to tell them that they've come to the wrong place. God isn't a thing like music or exercise or food or friendships or movies or any other part-time activity. Church can be a part of your life, and I certainly hope it is, but God can't be a part of your life. We believe that the true life of the universe is not my life or your life. It is God's life. So the question is not whether or not you want God to be a part of your life, it's whether or not you want to be a part of God's life. I remember the husband of a friend telling the story of the birth of their first child, and it went something like this. At about 2 p.m, the contractions started getting pretty fast and furious, so I drove her to the hospital. Traffic wasn't bad. Rush hour hadn't started yet. It took forever for me to check her in. They wanted all the insurance information. I ended up filling out millions of forms. Anyway, I got back to her room. I guess the water had broken or something, but things weren't moving very fast. And I had a couple of business calls to make, so she said it was okay, so I went back to the office. Must have been there till about 9 or 10 that night, and I stopped back at the hospital. Things were still not that far along. They said something about her not having enough centimeters or something like that. So I got back home about 11 or so. I watched the late game on TV. Must have drifted off because they woke me up about 3 or 4 to say the baby was coming. So I drag myself back into the car. I drive back to the hospital in time for the baby, but it still didn't happen right away. They don't have those things timed very well, by the way. There was still a lot of pushing and shoving and screaming and stuff, and by the time I got back home, I only had time enough for a shower, shave, and change of clothes before I got back to work. And because I hadn't gotten much sleep, I was grumpy all day, let me tell you. I swear to God, that's how he told the story of the birth of his first child. So what do you think about that father? Do you know how to say self-centered? He may be extreme, but he's not that far removed from how you and I often are. We're so small-minded sometimes. We're so self-centered. We're so afflicted with ourselves and our own perspectives. We're incapable of seeing things through somebody else's eyes, somebody else's perspective, or being sensitive to someone else's needs. We're so wrapped up in our own lives, we can't even begin to enter into God's life. Contrast that young father with the mother-to-be Mary in our scripture reading this morning, who shows us what it's like to enter into God's life. Now, before you hear this passage, let me remind you that you may think that God's life is filled with great big emotions and great big events and big famous people, and that all of that stuff excludes you and me. But remember again how Luke tells the Christmas story. He begins by introducing the Emperor Augustus, but then dismisses him right away. This story isn't about the emperor, the so-called most famous and powerful person in the world. Then Luke introduces us to Quirinius, the governor of Syria, the most important man in Jesus' little world. But the story isn't about him either. He's cast aside. The story isn't set in Rome, the capital of the world. It isn't even set in Jerusalem, the capital of Judea. It's set in Bethlehem. Nowhere. And it's about Mary and Joseph. Nobody's. And in God's life, what happened to Mary and Joseph is the most important thing that ever happened. So being a part of God's life doesn't mean going to big important places and doing big important things with big important people. In God's life, the real miracles happen in backwater places among folks you never heard of. Places like here. People like you and me.